Boa noite.
Pessoal, boa noite. É com muita satisfação que eu dou as boas-vindas a todos e todas para a sessão de abertura do 14º Encontro Nacional de Economia Ecológica, cujo título é Crises Sistêmicas e as Contribuições da Economia Ecológica. Nesta 14ª versão do nosso evento, temos a alegria de contar com a parceria institucional da Universidade Federal do Sul da Bahia, que desde o início aceitou o desafio conjunto de organizar este encontro numa conjuntura tão adversa. Desde já, nossos mais sinceros agradecimentos à UFSB e toda a sua equipe pelo apoio e parceria nesses meses de organização. Nesta noite, eu, professor Daniel, serei o mestre de cerimônias desta sessão inaugural do 14º ECOECO. Sem mais delongas, gostaria de formar nossa mesa virtual de abertura, convidando a professora Willian, pró-reitora de Extensão e Cultura da UFSB, que hoje representa a magnífica reitora, professora Joana Guimarães, e toda a administração superior da universidade. Convido também o nosso querido presidente de honra, o professor Clóvis Cavalcanti, e o professor Leonardo Evangelista Moraes, assessor da reitoria para assuntos da sustentabilidade e presidente da Comissão Local de Organização. Anunciada a composição desta mesa de abertura, gostaria de passar a palavra para a professora Willian, para que ela pudesse abrir oficialmente os trabalhos do nosso 14º ECOECO.
Obrigada, professor Daniel. Vocês me ouvem bem? Sim. Então, olá, boa noite a todas, todos, todes. Eu desejo que estejam muito bem, com saúde física, mental, com serenidade. Como representante da Pró-Reitoria de Extensão e Cultura da Universidade Federal da Bahia, aqui hoje também em nome da nossa reitora, professora Joana Angélica Guimarães da Luz, nós agradecemos de coração o convite da Comissão Organizadora do 14º Encontro Nacional de Economia Ecológica, e na pessoa do coordenador nacional, professor Daniel Caixeta. Eu cumprimento todas as pessoas que compõem esta mesa de abertura, mais notadamente aqui, professor Clóvis, Cavalcanti, meu colega, professor Leonardo, toda a comissão organizadora, e saúdo todas as pessoas que participarão das atividades do encontro, cuja programação está muito convidativa e apropriada para o momento que vivemos, começando pelo tema geral, que o professor Daniel já expôs, que é crises sistêmicas e as contribuições da economia ecológica. Bem, é quase impossível, em meio a tanto negacionismo, incluindo o climático, e a tanta destruição sistemática chancelada por dirigentes, não conseguimos deixar de pensar em significantes como crise, colapso, apocalipse, extinção, escassez, na ideia de progresso como significante vazio, como propõe Nancy Fraser, e na crítica aos inegáveis malogros do que conhecemos como modernidade. De modo complementar, parece que não podemos escapar também de pensar em alguma forma de existência planetária harmoniosa, em formas alternativas de vida, em outros mundos possíveis, que inclusive existem ou resistem entre nós, de que os povos ameríndios e tantos outros pelo mundo constituem exemplos. Afinal, ainda estamos por aqui. No contexto da pandemia de coronavírus, muitos reivindicavam e reivindicam seu mundo de volta, enquanto outros pensaram e pensam nas conexões possíveis para o ressurgimento das potências de vida, para além do medo do fim do mundo, num movimento contra-apocalíptico de rotas adiante, expressões que tomam emprestadas da professora Ildinei Cavalcanti da UFAL. Para acreditar em algo possível, e principalmente para agir no mundo, precisamos de utopias. Mas onde podemos buscá-las em meio a tanto horror? Se a natureza é insubstituível e se esgota diante de nós. A intelectual Donna Haraway argumenta que o enfrentamento crítico ao capitaloceno, uma caracterização que ela parece preferir a antropoceno, pode ser feito a partir de um convite a habitar um devir com, isto é, a nos tornarmos uns aos outros capazes do cultivo de responsabilidades. Ela separa, sem palavra. Não responsabilidades no sentido mais tradicional. Não que ela chama de uma lista de obrigações éticas e políticas a cumprir, mas o cultivo da capacidade de reagir aos estragos do capitaloceno num grau muito profundo, e, se possível, considerando perspectivas feministas. A isso, ela chama de tuloceno, um viés talvez possível que nos permita, quem sabe, tornarmos-nos com muitos, fazendo parentes, para usar uma expressão da autora, coligando-nos com outras espécies. A autora não apresenta o tuloceno como promessa messiânica ou saída para o caos em que vivemos, mas como uma aliança entre espécies diferentes, numa ecojustiça de multiespécies, numa utopia anticapitalista orientada pela desconstrução das narrativas hegemônicas controladas pelo capitaloceno. Especialmente num momento como este, quando lamentamos tantas mortes evitáveis, principalmente no caso do Brasil, trago rapidamente aqui algumas palavras de Haraway. Uma maneira de viver e morrer bem, como seres mortais no Tuloceno, é unir forças para reconstituir refúgios, para tornar possível uma parcial e robusta recuperação e recomposição biológica, cultural, política, tecnológica, que deve incluir o luto por perdas irreversíveis. Essa noção de tuloceno, mais do que suplantar por completo as noções de antropoceno, de capitaloceno, chama atenção para a necessidade de torcer os sentidos postos, considerar outras relações, mesmo as que parecem impossíveis entre o humano e o não humano, sem perder de vista que nosso tempo é um tempo de muitos riscos, mas não de game over, como vi Haraway dizer numa entrevista. Pelo menos ainda não. Sigamos com o problema, para fazer um trocadilho com o título de seu livro, que é Permanecendo com o Problema. Nessa perspectiva de que ainda estamos aqui, apesar de tudo, a jornalista, escritora e ativista Eliane Brum, num texto de março de 2020, portanto, do início da pandemia, escreveu assim: a pandemia revelou que somos capazes de fazer mudanças radicais em termos recorde. E também, a beleza que ainda resta no mundo é justamente que nada está dado enquanto ainda estivermos vivos. Então, é nesse espírito, em nome da nossa reitora e da comunidade da UFSB, né, que eu declaro aqui aberto o encontro. Desejo uma excelente conferência de abertura e momentos maravilhosos durante esse evento para todas as pessoas participantes. Um abraço a todas e todos.
Muito obrigado, professora Willian. Gostaria agora de convidar o nosso presidente de honra, o professor Clóvis Cavalcanti, para algumas palavras nesta sessão de abertura.
Obrigado, Daniel. É com muita alegria que eu estou aqui presente, participando dessa sessão de abertura, sobretudo porque eu me empenhei desde o começo pela criação da ECOECO, junto com Peter May, que foi o grande cabeça de tudo, e depois, na própria criação da Sociedade Internacional de Economia Ecológica, de cujo seminário fundador, logo depois do primeiro congresso em Washington, eu participei também, e isso me deu a certeza de que nós somos obrigados a fazer alguma coisa no nosso plano de trabalho para tentar conter o avanço da destruição do mundo. A economia ecológica serve como uma plataforma para esse tipo de trabalho. Então, eu me congratulo com Daniel, com todo o pessoal da universidade. Eu saúdo Willian, saúdo Léo, saúdo Peter May e saúdo também William Rees, Bill Rees. Eu tenho a alegria de ter sugerido o nome de Bill Rees para essa palestra inaugural, porque tenho grande admiração por ele e, sobretudo, pela ênfase que ele dá numa questão que ele vai tratar logo no começo da sua palestra, que é o do chamado overshoot, da pegada ecológica sobre a biocapacidade. Nós estamos numa rota de desastre. Isso foi anunciado em 1992 por Henry Kendall, prêmio Nobel de Física, professor do MIT, que disse exatamente isso: estamos em rota de colisão, e esse problema só se agravou com o tempo. Então, a nossa obrigação como economistas ecológicos é refletir sobre o que está acontecendo no mundo, porque, como me disse Zé Lida Veiga outro dia, a questão não é se a espécie humana será extinta ou não, é quando será. Esse é o grande problema, e nós estamos vendo, pelo agravamento das condições ecológicas globais, como o próprio Rees tem acentuado, a marcha para o colapso causado pela insustentabilidade. Então, como nesse cargo muito gratificante, presidente de honra da ECOECO, eu faço a minha saudação, cumprimento todos vocês que deram o melhor do seu empenho para a realização desse encontro. E eu que participei de quadros de todos os eventos, todos os encontros bienais da sociedade brasileira e da Internacional de Economia Ecológica, estou especialmente feliz com isso. Eu acho que é um momento de nós nos cumprimentarmos e ter esperança de que algo pode ser feito. Essa é a nossa função, o nosso papel, e eu me coloco aqui à disposição de participar sempre das atividades que interessam para nós evitarmos o colapso ambiental global. Muito obrigado a todos, grande abraço aqui de Olinda, a terra de Pernambuco por excelência.
Obrigado, Clóvis, pelas palavras.
Obrigado.
Eu tenho a mais absoluta certeza que muitas pessoas estão lamentando não poder te encontrar, estar próximo fisicamente a você, já que você alegra os nossos encontros. Agora, eu convido o professor Leonardo, Evangelista Moraes, pela comissão organizadora local.
Boa noite, pessoal. Saudando a professora Willian, nossa colega aqui da UFSB. Saúdo toda a comunidade universitária da UFSB que nesse momento nos acompanha sincronamente, ou pode, né, no canal do YouTube da ECOECO, nos acompanhar também assincronamente. Saúdo o professor Daniel e o professor Clóvis, em nome de quem saúdo também toda a comunidade da Sociedade Brasileira de Economia Ecológica. E saúdo também o professor Peter, o professor Willian, em nome de quem saúdo todos os congressistas que desenvolverão esse evento nos próximos dias. É uma felicidade muito grande para a gente estar sediando, uma felicidade e uma tristeza ao mesmo tempo, né? Uma felicidade estar sediando esse evento que mostra a transversalidade, né? Eu sou biólogo e estar conversando, estar aprendendo com a Sociedade Brasileira de Economia Ecológica tem me ensinado muito. Isso mostra a transversalidade desse tema, né, da sustentabilidade. Mas é uma alegria desse lado, né, da gente estar sediando, mas é uma tristeza porque falta o abraço, falta o prazer de conhecer presencialmente o professor Clóvis e os demais colegas da ECOECO. Então, fica aqui também a expectativa e a vontade para, numa próxima oportunidade, numa próxima edição futura, superado essa loucura dessa pandemia, que a gente lamenta aí as mais de 600 mil mortes no Brasil, a gente possa sediar novamente um evento fisicamente. A nossa jovem UFSB, ela tem apenas 7 anos de existência, né? Mas está sempre de portas abertas para receber eventos desse tipo. Eu já agradeço a confiança do professor Daniel, que abraçou a proposta, né, e ofereceu, né, convidou a UFSB a fazer parte desse momento, e gostaria rapidamente só de também agradecer aos nossos colegas, a professora Florisvalda, que representou o Centro de Formação em Ciências Ambientais, a professora Lilian Rego, que representou o Centro de Formação em Ciências Agroflorestais, o professor Frederico Neves, que representou o Centro de Formação em Desenvolvimento Territorial, a professora Valéria Janella, que representou o Centro de Formação em Ciências Humanas e Sociais, e a professora Silvia Aquimo, né, que representou o Centro de Formação em Políticas Públicas e Tecnologias Sociais, além do professor Spence, que agora mais ao final da organização, representando o Centro de Formação em Artes, se juntou à nossa equipe da organização local para permitir as intervenções culturais que vocês verão ao longo do evento. Então, é uma fala apenas de gratidão pela confiança da ECOECO e pela confiança dos colegas que trabalharam conosco. Bom evento para todos e todas, e seguimos trabalhando.
Muito obrigado pelas suas palavras. Assim como eu disse para o Clóvis, que muita gente deve estar lamentando não encontrá-lo dessa vez, muita gente também, aliás, todos nós estamos lamentando não estarmos em Porto Seguro neste momento para realizar esse evento. Muito obrigado mais uma vez. E o Leonardo, assim como toda a equipe da UFSB, foi uma grata surpresa, porque ele teve o seu primeiro contato, né, ou pelo menos o nosso primeiro contato foi por meio de um curso de Economia Ecológica da ECOECO oferecido na SBPC. Né? Então, é sinal de que esses minicursos, os cursos, né, têm dado bons resultados. Bom, eu gostaria de agradecer a palavra de todos vocês. E antes de desfazer essa mesa de abertura, eu gostaria de fazer alguns apontamentos, se vocês me permitirem. Em primeiro lugar, dizer que a ECOECO se sente muito grata e orgulhosa de inaugurar mais um evento. É a nossa 14ª edição. Por incrível que pareça, a organização de um evento remoto não é tão trivial como pode parecer no primeiro momento, principalmente num contexto de tão poucos recursos e de constante sucateamento dos aparatos de financiamento da ciência e da tecnologia no nosso país. Os custos, é verdade, são menores no mundo virtual, mas eles não são inexistentes. Daí, infelizmente, a nossa impossibilidade de oferecer um evento 100% gratuito. Em segundo lugar, como a professora Willian já disse, o tema geral do nosso evento, crises sistêmicas e as contribuições da economia ecológica, não poderia ser mais oportuno. Esperamos que as discussões ao longo desta semana possam jogar luz na busca de solução de várias crises que a humanidade enfrenta coletivamente. Desde já, a todos e a todas eu desejo um ótimo evento, discussões frutíferas e bons reencontros, ainda que virtuais. Tenho certeza que, mesmo distantes fisicamente, o espírito de amizade e fraternidade não é menor. Quero expressar meus agradecimentos, a todos que nos ajudaram nesta organização, aos meus colegas da Comissão Nacional Organizadora, aos colegas da Comissão Local, a equipe da UFSB, ao Comitê Científico, ao Corpo de Revisores, à Administração Superior da UFSB pela acolhida, pela equipe da Síntese Eventos, principalmente nas pessoas do Camilo, da Ana Maria e da Beatriz. Antes de prosseguirmos para a palestra inaugural, eu gostaria de relembrar pessoas próximas à ECOECO que nos deixaram nesses últimos 2 anos. Relembro aqui, de maneira respeitosa, o professor Eugênio Miguel Canepa, que foi um importante aliado da ECOECO, sendo autor de alguns capítulos de livros já publicados pela ECOECO. Relembro também Stuart Scott, um incansável defensor da causa do desenvolvimento sustentável e muito próximo do nosso presidente de honra, o Clóvis. Menciono também Átila Calvente, frequente nos encontros da ECOECO e um entusiasta da economia ecológica e que, infelizmente, hoje não pode estar aqui. Queremos também prestar nossos tributos a todas as vítimas desta terrível pandemia. Aos 3 nomes mencionados e também às vítimas da Covid, peço 1 minuto de silêncio a todos e a todas. Obrigado. Dando sequência, convido o professor Peter Ney, ex-presidente da International Society for Ecological Economics e ex-presidente da ECOECO, para que assuma os trabalhos daqui por diante, mediando a palestra inaugural proferida pelo professor Willian Rees. Muito obrigado a todos e todas, e mais uma vez tenham todos um excelente evento e obrigado pela presença.
Boa noite, todo mundo. É uma grande felicidade estar aqui na inauguração do 14º Encontro da Sociedade Brasileira de Economia Ecológica, ECOECO, que eu fui fundador, entre os fundadores, junto com Clóvis e vários outros que estão na plateia, no Ademar. Uma felicidade estar entre vocês. E particularmente agradecemos a oportunidade de estar junto com os colegas da Universidade do Sul da Bahia, o Leonardo, a Willian, e agradeço ao Daniel e ao Clóvis pelas palavras de abertura. Estou aqui meramente como ponte entre a inauguração e a palestra do nosso querido amigo e professor Willian Rees. William e Clóvis e eu estamos participando de um grupo importante de pensadores da economia ecológica, desde Richard Norgaard, Herman Daly, Peter Victor e outros que estão participando, o Clóvis e eu, como os jovens do grupo, realmente de velhos de economia ecológica, que estávamos acompanhando um estagiário que foi selecionado pela IECE para servir de entrada, ponto de entrada no Vaticano, nos permitindo uma proximidade com as deliberações sobre o desenvolvimento humano, que o Dicastery de Desenvolvimento Humano do Vaticano está levantando na pessoa do cardeal Peter Turkson. Então, o Bill e eu e os demais membros desse comitê estamos semanalmente, quase semanalmente, reunindo e aprofundando temas de grande importância para questões de sustentabilidade global. E sempre o Bill tem sido o velho rabuguento, aí, rabugento, procurando questionar como que é possível o mundo está tão preocupado com alguns temas quando o sistema todo está em overshoot. Então, o Bill vai nos agraciar com uma palestra focada na questão que ele titula como a mudança climática uma distração perigosa, uma perspectiva da economia ecológica, e eu queria só falar poucas palavras quem é o Bill Rees, né? Como que ele se vislumbra chegando até aqui com esse tipo de mensagem um pouco pessimista, um pouco malthusiano, talvez, tendo mais uma posição que ele se mantém ao longo do seu importante histórico como pesquisador, pensador, contribuidor à ciência de sustentabilidade. O Bill Rees é um ecologista humano, economista ecológico, ex-diretor e professor emérito da Escola de Planejamento da Universidade de British Columbia, Colômbia Britânica, né, em Vancouver, Canadá. Sua pesquisa se concentra nos requisitos ecológicos para o desenvolvimento sustentável, na avaliação de energia e as barreiras comportamentais e socioculturais à mudança. Ele é mais conhecido, e toda a comunidade da economia ecológica também aplaude o co-desenvolvimento da análise de pegada ecológica, que ele foi autor principal, junto com Mathis Wackernagel, seu orientando de doutorado, e junto com ele eu tive a grande oportunidade em 2012, durante o Rio +20, de presentear para o Bill e para o Mathis o prêmio Bolding, de Kenneth Bolding, memorial do prêmio de Economia Ecológica, e eles também ganharam no mesmo ano o prêmio Planeta Azul. Então, com essas palavras, eu quero passar a bola para o Bill, para ele apresentar sua palestra, e depois a gente vai receber perguntas da plateia e fazer uma dinâmica mais participativa. Muito obrigado, Bill. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. It's an absolute delight to be back in Brazil for the first time since 2012. It's a very great honor to have been invited to open this conference and to meet so many old friends and make some new ones. Greetings, Clóvis. It's a wonderful thing to see you in your own turf. And of course, Peter. I'm going to jump right into this after thanking everyone who's spoken before me for such a wonderful welcome, and to wish you all success in this conference. I think it's very brave of Clóvis to suggest a grumpy old man like myself to address the conference. I think you'll find I have a lot of questions. I don't have many answers. So I'm going to use my time to help set up the problem, and perhaps the rest of the conference over the next little while will provide us with more of the solutions. So I'm going to, first of all, get into my screen share here. The question I'm asking is climate change a dangerous distraction? And I'm going to try to frame this in the context of ecological economics. So the first question I'd like to ask you is the human brain obsolete? And it's not a trivial question, because we evolved in the context of very small tribal groups living in very limited but relatively knowledgeable, predictable ecosystems. And the result of this rather simple beginning is that we tend to think in simplistic, linear, reductionist ways. We simply don't get the idea of complexity. In other words, modern techno-industrial humans are not cognitively equipped to understand, let alone control, the mind-numbingly complex world systems that we ourselves have created. We don't truly grasp the workings of the global economy, of geopolitics, or even the internet, let alone the climate system and the ecosphere. And to illustrate this, I'd like to make a very simple point, that modern techno-industrial society tends to fixate on a single problem at a time. So a few years ago, it was the economy. Then it became climate change. Then the pandemic took over the news networks. And now we're back to climate change. We never seem to connect the dots between all of these things, because they are all part of the same problem. In particular, climate change is not the existential threat facing humanity. It's an extremely important problem, but it's not the main problem. The present focus on climate change is in fact a distraction from the real meta problem. So the existential threat that threatens humankind, and really is something that we have to take seriously in terms of our own survival as a species, is something that we call overshoot from the perspective of ecological economics. Overshoot means that the human enterprise, and that's just all of our people plus the economy, is using biological resources faster than ecosystems can regenerate, and we're producing wastes in excess of the assimilative capacity of the ecosphere. We are literally consuming and polluting the biophysical basis, the ecological basis of our own existence. And this is the archetypal definition of biophysical unsustainability. Virtually all other environmental problems, including climate change, are merely symptoms of overshoot. In other words, overshoot is the overriding cause. And here are some of the others. We needn't dwell on this, but you're all familiar with depleting groundwater, acidifying oceans, overfishing, driving biodiversity losses, and so on. And when you add all of this together, again, it illustrates the extent to which we are destroying the biophysical basis that sustains us. So the fact of the matter is, whether we like to face it or not, is that untreated, overshoot is a terminal condition. It will take the human system down. And we use ecological footprint analysis to give us some rough estimate of just how large this overshoot is. Your ecological footprint is just a measure of the amount of productive ecosystems you require to sustain you and your lifestyle. And we know that on Earth today, there is only about 12.1 billion hectares of productive ecosystem. But the humans are using it. Human beings are using the Earth as if there were 20.9 billion hectares. In other words, we are using the planet as if it were 73% larger than it actually is. How can we do this? Because there are enormous stocks of so-called natural capital, forests, soils, fish stocks, and so on. But we're now drawing these down. Instead of just using the annual productivity, we're destroying the capital base of our own existence. And this means, again, that the human enterprise is fundamentally unsustainable. And it also means, and I think this is a real warning, that everyone is competing for everyone else for the limited and shrinking biocapacity of the planet. This is a very difficult realization when we see such superpowers as China and the United States and Russia ramping up their nuclear capacity, for example. So the best known symptom of overshoot is undoubtedly climate change, because everybody has been made aware of this. And I'm not trying to underplay it at all. It's an enormous problem. The 6 warmest years in instrumental record have been in the past 6 years, and 9 of the 10 warmest years have all occurred since 2005. So there's no disputing that this is a major issue, but there are other major issues. And I think this one is one that competes certainly with climate change. That's plummeting biodiversity. And because most people now live in cities, we're not quite as aware of this as we might otherwise be. But look at the scale of it. If we go back to the dawn of agriculture, wild mammals were about 99% of the total biomass, the weight of mammals on Earth, and humans were less than 1%. Today, humans constitute 32% of mammalian biomass, and our cattle and livestock another 67%. So that together, humans and our domestic animals take up well over 95 to 98% of the total biomass on Earth, and wild mammals are reduced to 1.5% of that biomass. So humans, through our massive growth in the last couple of 100 years, have literally competitively displaced non-human life from their habitats and their food sources. And what human beings take from ecosystems is simply not available to other species. So the larger the human enterprise becomes, the more people there are, the bigger our economy, the smaller the residual is for other species. So humans have become the cause of what's called the Holocene, or the 6th extinction, the 6th mass extinction that we're aware of life on Earth. Overshoot's a very recent development. Most people aren't even aware of it yet, and part of the reason is because we're embedded in it. But look at these numbers. It took about 250,000 years for modern humans to reach a population of 1 billion early in the 19th century. So for most of our evolutionary history, 250,000 years, in fact, further back than that, we've been held in check by negative feedback of food shortages, resource shortages, conflicts, and so on and so forth. Humans have the potential to expand exponentially, but for most of our history, we've been held in check by negative feedback. Then, for some reason, population expanded by an additional 7.5-fold in just 200 years. So in 1,500th as much time, we expanded 7-fold. And that is an astonishing situation. Positive feedback took over. So negative feedback was eliminated, and the positive power of our reproductive potential took over. Meanwhile, not only did population increase by a factor of 7 or 8, but real gross world product increased by 100-fold in those 200 years. and per capita income, that is to say consumption of energy and material, increased by a factor of 13 and up to 25 times in the richest countries. So all of this massive growth has occurred on a planet that didn't get any larger. And this is what it looks like in graphic terms. We could extend the x-axis back 250,000 years. And again, the point is that for most of that period, there has been no growth. Growth is a product of the last 3 centuries, and particularly just the last 200 years. And there's 2 important points to take from this curve. First of all, it's fossil fuel, the driver of climate change, that enabled this expansive growth to take place. Because fossil fuel is the means by which human beings acquire all the food and other resources needed to grow the population and to construct all of the infrastructure of modern societies. The second point to take of this is that rapid continuous economic and population growth is an anomaly. It's an abnormal state of affairs, because normally populations are held in check by negative feedback. So what we see here is the domination of positive feedback mechanisms, both in the economy and in populations. But the main point is that the growth spurt that recent generations, just 10 generations of thousands of generations of people take to be normal, this is the single most anomalous or abnormal period in human history. And again, the connection with fossil fuel is absolute. Again, because it has grown, our use of fossil fuel has grown exponentially. Half of all the fossil fuel ever used has been consumed in just the past 30 years. 90% of the fossil fuels have been burned since I was born, since 1943. So really, just in the last few decades, we've seen a massive increase in the human ecological footprint, the burden of humankind on the earth. And of course, this exponential growth in fossil fuel use is the cause of accelerating climate change. And we all know the very tight relationship that exists. It's an almost perfect relationship between energy consumption and growth of the world economy. So the scale of the human enterprise is a direct result of abundant, cheap energy. Now, there's 2 factors behind this massive explosion in the last couple of years. I've already touched on one of these, and it comes from basic human nature. Humans, like every other species, every species has the capacity to expand exponentially, unless they are constrained by negative feedback. So when those feedbacks are taken away, as fossil fuel relieved us from the scarcities that kept us down, humans will expand to fill all accessible habitats, and we will use up all available resources. And in the case of human beings, the concept of availability is constantly being redefined by technology. We get better and better at mining, at fishing, and otherwise exploiting the planet. And hence our growth continues despite the fact that we're wrecking the biophysical basis of our own existence. The second factor is culture. So I've already emphasized there's a biological component, but there's a cultural component as well. I'll just call it nurture. And it comes from the fact that humans uniquely, socially construct our own realities. In other words, we make things up as we go along. We create stories and narratives, and we don't live in reality. More accurately, then, we construct conceptual lenses through which we perceive external reality. So all of our political ideologies, religious doctrines, economic paradigms, scientific models, and cultural narratives are made up social constructs. These constructs then provide lenses through which we perceive reality, and they determine how we perceive that reality. And there's an issue here in that our perceptions may not be an accurate representation of de facto biophysical reality. In other words, how we perceive may not accurately reflect anything out there in the real world. Now, this is a potential source of enormous problems, because people live out of their socially constructed views of the world as if they were real. And presently, we have a global, what I call the modern techno-industrial society. It's living out of an elaborate social construct called neoliberal economics. So there's nothing in nature called neoliberal economics. It's a complete contrivance of the human mind, a social construct of the human mind. And we are now acting as if it were a real representation of reality. The problem is that neoliberal economics, coming from a simple mind, is simplistically mechanical and reductionist. Neoliberal economics contains no useful information whatever about the structure or dynamics of the ecological systems or the social systems with which the economy interacts in the real world. It's a very, very bad model of biophysical reality. And many of you who have taken a course in economics will recognize this as what is sometimes called the starting point of economic analysis. It's the so-called circular flows model. It's a flow of money in the economy and a countercurrent of goods and services. But the point is the standard model of what the economy consists of, there's no environment. In fact, the model shows no means of connecting with anything independent or outside of itself. So that's the fundamental model from which we are flying the planet. Unfortunately, once you believe that the economy is separate and independent of any environment, it reinforces our innate propensity to expand, so that the neoliberal model promotes unlimited economic growth enabled by continuous technological advances. So we start from a perception of human exceptionalism. We're not part of the environment. We're not constrained by biophysical laws, and hence we can grow without any constraint whatsoever, and we can continue to do this because of our cleverness, our human ingenuity. And several very famous statements of this belief have been used over and over. I'll quote two here. There are no limits to the carrying capacity of the earth that are likely to bind at any time in the foreseeable future. That's Larry Summers, a former president of the US, or rather chair of the US Economic Council of Advisors, a former president of Harvard University. Julian Simon, another professor of management studies at the University of Maryland. We have in our hands now the technology to feed, clothe, and supply energy to an ever-growing population for the next 7 billion years. Well, that's an impossibility theorem, but it's one that many people believe in and take very seriously. Now, I want to put this whole business of our very simple economic model in the context of what I consider the most important of cyberneticists' maxims. Cybernetics is simply controlled science. Stafford Beer said it, I suppose, most simply. We cannot regulate our interaction with any aspect of reality that our model of reality does not contain. So if we're operating an economic model that contains no information whatsoever about the environment, then we can't use our economics to regulate our interaction with that environment. Ross Ashby, another very well-known cyberneticist, created something called Ashby's Law of Requisite Variety. One version of it is, when the variety or complexity of the environment exceeds the capacity, which is to say the variety and complexity of a regulatory system, then the environment will dominate and ultimately destroy that system. So again, put that in the context of the economy, ignoring the environment will dominate and ultimately destroy the economy, because the economic models that we're using to run the planet contain no useful information about that environment. So it follows that neoliberal economics is utterly incompetent to guide modern culture's interactions with biophysical, or for that matter, social reality. And we can get some idea of how powerful our economic models and our belief in our own invulnerability are by simply looking at the history of the increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Again, one of the major drivers of climate change. But we can see that this curve, it's an exponential growth curve, has really not been affected by any of the 25, now 26 COP meetings, or the half dozen agreements that countries have agreed to reduce this curve, and it's had no effect whatsoever. And in fact, we're on our way now at COP 26. We're already at 417 parts per million. It's rising at the rate of 2 or 3 parts per million. is 49% above pre-industrial levels, and nothing we have done or agreed to has affected that curve. Now, we've been talking a lot about exponential growth, and that reminds me of my old days in ecology as a population ecologist, and a warning from population ecology. Any species that is introduced to an environment with abundant resources or when favorable conditions occur will go through a boom phase of exponential growth. But at some point, nutrients become depleted or other forms of negative feedback come in and the population drops. There's a bust phase. And what I would argue is that as matters stand, the expansion of the human enterprise resembles the plague phase of a one-time boom-bust population cycle in nature. So this is the theoretical model from a standard ecology textbook. Here's an example from the real world of reindeer introduced to islands off the coast of Alaska with plentiful lichens. The reindeer populations exploded and then crashed because they ran out of resources. But again, put this in the context of our population growth curve. We are up here right now. There's no question it can't continue. The only real question is, how do we come down from this explosion? And again, see the resemblance in all of these curves. Human beings are not exceptional. We are not in any way relieved from having to obey the basic laws of population ecology. So we have a choice. Overshoot is a terminal condition. In coming years, the human enterprise will contract. The population will drop. As an intelligent, rational, plan-capable species, we can theoretically choose between business as usual, which risks a chaotic implosion imposed by nature, followed by geopolitical turmoil and resource wars. And basically, that's the tack we're on right now. Or we can try to come together as a global community and develop a well-planned, orderly, cooperative descent toward what we would call a socially just sustainability for everyone. And that's the choice before us. But what modern society seems completely unable to acknowledge from within the neoliberal economic paradigm is that the only way to fix our current problem, which is not climate change, but rather overshoot, is through significant reductions in energy and material throughput. We must reduce total consumption and waste production by at least 50% globally and by about 80% in rich countries like Canada. No politician could survive these kinds of policies if the population remains ignorant of our basic biophysical realities here. So again, the only way to fix overshoot, and by the way, by fixing overshoot, we fix climate change, biodiversity losses, and all of the other symptoms, is through these massive reductions. So to act consistently and reasonably within our best science would require the planned economic and population contraction to the 1 to 2 billion people who could live more equitably and fairly well within the means of nature by the end of this century. So this is how I've conceived the situation. Again, we're in a situation of overshoot. That's the solid red line. And I think we're getting pretty close to the peak, and the peak will occur in the next couple of decades. We then have a choice. We can crash, and that's following the solid red line right to the bottom, a systemic collapse. Or we can begin to smooth out this curve and follow the dotted red line. This is the line that brings us below the carrying capacity of the planet. Unfortunately, because we are in overshoot, we have greatly reduced the long-term carrying capacity. So there's a loss of carrying capacity from overshoot. What we should have done is followed the green line, an initial period of exponential growth, tempered then by negative feedback from within society that would bring us to a nice population level within the carrying capacity of the planet at a reasonable standard of living. So here we are. This is what we should have done, the green line. The best we can do now is come down from the peak and follow the dotted red line and develop some kind of equilibrium with the natural environment. Now, that's what we should do. But a common fallacy of our culture including a fallacy held by most academics, the mainstream media, and ordinary people, is that human beings are rational, that policy will be guided by the evidence. But history shows that humans are not primarily rational. Emotion and instinct will trump reason. And we've known this for a long time. The Greek statesman Demosthenes, over 2,000 years ago, wrote, "The easiest thing of all is to deceive oneself, for we believe whatever we want to believe." Gustave Le Bon, the first French psychologist to put this in context, said, "The masses have never thirsted after truth. They turn aside from evidence that is not to their taste, preferring to deify error." Barbara Tuchman, 100 years later, in her famous book, The March of Folly, wrote, "Wooden-headedness plays a remarkably large role in government. It is acting according to wish, while not allowing oneself to be deflected by the facts." So this is the nature of humankind. We are very good at self-deception and at believing what we want to believe in spite of the best evidence to the contrary. And sometimes editorial cartoons say it all. I thought this is one of the more brilliant ones. So when confronting crises, humans prefer comforting, socially constructed illusions and stories over those narratives that are based on evidence of harsh reality. So what the neoliberal economists are telling us, and others who believe in the technological future, is that technological solutions such as wind turbines, solar PV, electronic vehicles, and all sorts of unproved carbon and capture storage technologies can reverse climate change while sustaining growth and not jeopardizing the current social and economic system. So this is our current story, the one that is unfolding as we speak in COP26 in Glasgow. Clive Spash, a very well-known European ecological economist, has characterized this approach this way. Climate disaster policy is designed to serve the capitalist growth economy. So the latter becomes the solution to and not the cause of the problem. So we deceive ourselves into thinking that by pursuing exactly the same kinds of quote unquote solutions that got us into this mess, this will result in getting us out of this mess. And this, I think, is the grandest illusion ever to confront the human species. Another great cartoon, we're searching for answers, but because our minds are incapable of grasping complexity, and because we don't wish to face reality, we prefer our socially constructed illusions, we choose simple but wrong answers. So wind turbines, solar photovoltaics, electric vehicles, smart cities, geoengineering, all of these things are essentially growth-bound business as usual via techno fixes and will lead to collapse because they simply increase the human demands on the ecosphere, which is already in a state of increasing disorders because of excess human demands. The complex but correct answers have to do with recognition of the need to develop major lifestyle changes, greater equality, population planning. We need degrowth leading to improved well-being, including eco-stability and economic security for everyone. Difficult to do, but absolutely necessary. It's not a technical problem nearly so much as it is a social and political problem that's confronting humankind right now. And just to give you one example of the kind of things that I lie awake horrified about at night, is the failure of people voicing this technological optimism to do some simple arithmetic. So I'm just going to look at one problem with alternative energy. To replace 50% of global fossil fuel use with electricity by 2030, okay, that's kind of what we're on track. If we followed the Paris Accord, this is what we should do. 50% of fossil fuel use gone by 2050 or 2030, rather. To do that would require that the world construct 1.2 times the entire present cumulative global stock of wind farms and solar panels every year for the next 9 years, okay? So every year for the next 9 years, we have to replicate about 30 years accumulated stock of wind and solar installations. And this assumes that 1 unit of electricity is equal to 2.7 units of fossil energy, that hard to electrify applications will become easy to electrify, and that's by no means a given, and that there will be no growth in demand or mineral supply problems. And all of that is supposed to happen in a world in which we expect at least 2 billion more people by that time, and a 50% increase in demand for energy, at least by 2050. This is an impossibility theorem. It cannot be done in the real world. So I think that's a good thing, because the real problem is not climate change in the first place. Keep in mind that this whole impossibility theorem is designed to solve one symptom of a problem, which can't be solved by looking at the symptom in isolation. So the real problem is not climate change, it's overshoot. And keep in mind the following, this is very important. If humans were capable of applying another abundant, cheap source of energy, they would continue to use it to consume, pollute, and wreck the planet, because we would be following this, both our biological predisposition and the social construct of perpetual growth on a finite planet, again, an impossibility theorem. So I think, again, cartoonists sometimes put it in much better words. Here's a cartoon that explains everything I've been talking about. Assuming present trends continue, the odds are that we will become the best informed extinct species on the planet. So we know exactly what we should be doing. The data are perfectly clear, the science is good, and yet we don't apply our common sense or good technical analysis to the problems. What we need, of course, is a new economics, an ecological economics. And this is a crude diagram that puts it together. We see again the simple model of the economy down here, but this recognizes that it's not in isolation, but that it's contained within an ecosphere, that's the rectangular box, and that everything that happens in the economy draws on the ecosphere for available energy and material, and 100% of the consumed energy and material eventually returns to the ecosphere as pollution and waste. Even the final products are eventually discarded and become waste in the system. So unlike neoliberal economics, ecological economics sees the economy as an open, growing, fully contained, dependent subsystem of the materially closed, non-growing ecosphere. Herman Daly we're famous for pointing this out over and over again. The economy is not separate, it's contained and dependent on the ecosphere. So when we are in a state of overshoot, using the ecosphere faster than it can generate, then the human enterprise is analogous to a malignant parasite. And a parasite lives by destroying, that is to say, by consuming and polluting its host. Here we are then, the supposedly most intelligent species on Earth, living in a relationship with the planet that supports us as if we were a parasite on that host planet. So we need to redesign the human bioeconomy or eco-economy. We have to become an integral component of the ecosystems without destroying them. Economic models must reflect the structure and internal dynamics of the ecosystems that sustain the economy. We must restore balance between the positive and negative feedbacks that have to be established between humankind and nature. This means that the cult of growth, which is nothing more than quantitative accretion or getting bigger through techno-efficiency, must be replaced with an emphasis on true development. That means qualitative improvement. We can get better and achieve greater social equity, for example, over time. The ultimate goal, if we are an intelligent, a truly plan-oriented species that hope to survive, the ultimate goal of the human species today should be toward a smaller, steady-state global economy in which fewer people can thrive more equitably within the regenerative means of nature. The world economy must acknowledge that as long as we remain in overshoot, sustainable production and consumption means less production and consumption. The human eco-footprint is the product of average per capita consumption and population. This implies that we should be negotiating not climate issues in COP26, but rather major changes in consumer lifestyles. I've already mentioned that 80% reduction in material and energy consumption per capita in rich countries. By the way, that's technologically possible, but we're not talking about it. And the second thing we need is a global population strategy to enable a smooth descent to the 1 to 2 billion people that could live comfortably indefinitely within the biophysical means of nature. The ideas are quite simple, actually. So here's what we should be doing. It's just a sample of what ecological economics suggests. We should be phasing out non-essential and frivolous uses of fossil fuels. There's no question we need to phase out of fossil fuels, but we're not doing these things. We're not abolishing private vehicles, including, by the way, electronic vehicles, which are almost as bad over time. We should be getting rid of ATVs, jet skis, leaf blowers, air travel, and so on, based on fossil fuels at any rate. We should allocate the remaining fossil fuel budget, and some scientists say there is no remaining fossil fuel budget. Nevertheless, we should allocate the remaining fossil fuel use to essential uses. In agriculture, our food production is entirely fossil fuel based. On interurban truck transportation is another essential use that is not about to be electrified. So if we're going to continue using some fossil fuel, it ought to be on these essential uses. We should be implementing carbon taxes and resource depletion taxes. The point is to internalize social and ecological externalities. We should be moving more toward full social cost pricing with adjustments to the system so that poor people aren't disadvantaged. We should be relocalizing manufacturing and food production to reduce dependence on other countries and on unreliable global supply chains. We're already seeing a breakdown in some of these things, which is beginning to impact the economy in most countries. We need a fair income tax system and a minimum income strategy, because this will be a smaller economy with greater sharing, the need for greater equity. We need to reorganize our settlements into more self-reliant, steady-state, urban-centered bioregions that are integrated into local ecosystems. We need to restore essential ecosystems and life support services. We can't survive without the biodiversity that provides these services. We need to implement a global non-coercive planning, family planning and population program, starting with better education and economic independence for women, including, of course, free access to birth control. Well, so far, however, basic human nature prevails. We save the economy at the expense of the very environment that sustains us. So it's another component of human nature. We are what economists call discounters. We have an innate or natural tendency for temporal, spatial, and social discounting. We naturally value the certain, comfortable, present, and home communities and close relatives and friends over uncertain future threats, distant places, and complete strangers. So we are expert self-delusionists and denialists. And this is why the world has so far chosen to continue business as usual by alternative technological means. At COP26, I think we're going to see more and more pledges that really avoid reality. And this simply reveals the extent to which we are caught in our own paradigmatic trap. And I put it this way: that which is ecologically and socially necessary for sustainability is not politically feasible. But the politically feasible is ecologically and socially ineffective, if not catastrophic. So that's the bind we are in. We know what we have to do intellectually to conserve the environment that sustains us, but we have socially constructed political and social myths or narratives that make what we have to do impossible to execute. And hence we seem paralyzed, unable to move. So that's the end of my formal presentation. And what I hope I've done is describe the nature of the human dilemma. It's not a technical problem. It's a problem in consciousness. It's a problem in our cognitive inability to come to grips with the complexity that we ourselves have created. It's a problem associated with being trapped in social stories and in narratives that bear no relation to our actual relationship with reality. And I've now set up the basic issues. I think it's up to the rest of this conference to find all of the solutions. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Bill. Back online here. Well, that was a very stirring and worrying presentation. I think that you've definitely laid out a bunch of myths that we ourselves are deluding ourselves with about the possibility of restoring and overcoming the barriers to an ecologically fit energy system, as well as use of other resources. I've asked for people to make questions on the chat, and I've got at least one or two questions that have been raised. I think that Leonardo has a pretty long, actually, two questions. I would also want to know a little bit more, how would you distinguish between your perspective at this point on what our possibilities are and the agenda that has been set out by the degrowth movement? It seems to me that there's a lot in common, and that a good reason for us having had our last conference jointly with the degrowth research movement. And I think that there's the perspective on needing to not to necessarily degrow, but to actually realistically come down to a community-based economy which is able to harmoniously deal with scarcity in a realistic way, would be seemingly what the degrowth movement is saying, and you're saying, and what Greta Thunberg is saying. So I think that we've got some agreement, at least among us. Now, whether we can take that to the rest of the world is another question. Leo, would you like to present your questions to Bill yourself, or should I read them? What's your pleasure?
Should I attempt to answer that last question?
Yeah, well, yeah, you should answer that one too.
Okay,
have a chance.
There is a great deal in common with the degrowth movement and what I have to say. I think the degrowth people are somewhat more politically conservative than I am. They don't address directly the need for such a massive and rapid decrease, particularly in the population domain. But certainly the idea of degrowth, of shrinking the economy in an equitable way so that the whole of the human system can operate more or less sustainably within the biophysical means of nature, is something in common. By the way, I saw a question there, Peter. Someone asked whether they could have access to the slides, and I want to make them freely available to anyone who requests them, if that's okay.
Yes, of course. We're going to make the full slide presentation available in PDF online for download.
Good.
So, Leonardo, você quer apresentar suas próprias perguntas, ou você quer que a gente...
Pode ler, professor.
Okay. Então, let me try and read it. I'll read it in Portuguese and he'll translate. So, Professor William, sobre essa abordagem sobre a... I'm going to take off the Portuguese translation because otherwise I can't understand myself think. Professor William, sobre essa abordagem sobre a desconexão dos modelos neoliberais com o mundo real, como superar a dificuldade cognitiva dos políticos em perceber esta obviedade? Afinal das contas, até mesmo governos progressistas pelo mundo se abraçam às lógicas neoliberais. E uma segunda pergunta, essas lógicas neoliberais desconectadas dos limites do planeta e das demandas sociais muitas vezes são impostas aos países ditos subdesenvolvidos por força de investidores e países ditos desenvolvidos. É a lógica do tal Deus mercado. Como superar também a dificuldade cognitiva dessas forças políticas, econômicas, desses investidores internacionais? Did you get all that? Sorry. It's a lot to ask for. But
virtually the whole discussion of the next several weeks could be captured there. First of all, politicians are ordinary people like you and I very often. They're surrounded by advisors. They, like most of us, have grown up inculcated, contained by the social constructs of the culture that we live in. So they believe in growth because it's all the last 10 generations of people have seen is this growth. And it has been proclamated as the way of solving all of our problems, including poverty. But politicians have something else going for them. I think the more intelligent ones, certainly some that I have spoken to, are well aware of the nature of this crisis. But they are ultimate discounters because they have to be reelected. And they realize that in dealing with a population that is also embedded in this cult of growth, that to come to the people on an election and say, look, we have to change everything so that the wealthier among you will have to share a little bit more and the whole of the economy is going to shrink. So we have to modify the tax system and so on and so forth. This would not result in a happy electorate. So people are simply not prepared to hear this message. So if you're a politician and you know that you will be thrown out on your ear if you advance these kinds of policies, you're likely to go with the more comfortable story that we keep telling ourselves. Because by the time the crisis hits, from the perspective of most politicians, it'll be somebody else's problem. I can get reelected for 3 or 4 more years. When the crisis is 10 years away, it'll be somebody else's problem. You can't blame me for it. So as social discounters, politicians reign supreme. They have more to gain by discounting the future than any of the rest of us. Now, how we break through this is I really don't know. It's taken us several decades, perhaps since the beginning of the 19th century, the middle of the 19th century, to build this mythology of the neoliberal paradigm. So this is a social learning process. It will take decades to deconstruct it and put something else in its place. So that's a possibility, but it may not happen in time for us to make the changes necessary. So to dislodge people from our current way of thinking often requires a major shock. I'm not by any means an advocate of out and out revolution, but if the political people were to see tens of thousands or millions of people marching in the street, demanding real change, and then might have to start paying attention. And because right now, much of our political system is in the hands of corporate lobbyists of one kind or another. There are more corporate lobbyists in Glasgow right now for the oil and gas sector than any other group, for example. And they are calling the tune. So we have a society that is internally, I suppose, in conflict because we have all of this knowledge, but we have vested interests who want to ignore it. And they're the ones calling the shots and influencing the politicians. So social learning is extremely difficult until people are shocked into the recognition, hey, that this is much more serious than our capacity just to shove it off for another few years. And I think in the next few years, maybe less than a decade, we will see sufficiently major crises on Earth having to do with energy, having to do with the economics and the indebtedness of governments right now, the huge debt crisis, having to do with climate change itself, that people are going to start seeing things fall apart. And it may stir ordinary people sufficiently to get out there and become much more politically and actively engaged and showing politicians where their interests really lie. But until then, I suppose all we have got is the kind of meetings we're having right now, which tend slowly to raise to consciousness the nature of our problems. I guess that
I'm going to have to get that off of here. Somebody's trying to call me from Spamsville here. So we have another question from Guilherme da Silva. And he asks, Professor, do you think that, I'm going to translate it directly, do you think that we will be able to arrive at a consensus, a more healthy consensus for the planet before we enter in a collapse situation. Each of the political meetings that about climate, I get more pessimistic about our capacity to act. What do you think about that? Is it possible to arrive at consensus?
Well, it's a very good question. And I have to admit that in my darkest moments, and for exactly the same reasons, I showed you that accelerating curve of carbon concentrations in the atmosphere, no effect whatsoever of the various climate conferences. And the same is true in other domains. We're having virtually no impact on biodiversity loss. We're seeing no increase in our capacity to husband our soils and so on and so forth. So that we're seeing, you know, the expectations. Think about this. We expect 2 billion more people to join cities in the next 30 or 40 years. Well, cities are made out of steel and concrete, all of which requires the combustion of fossil fuels. So on our current track, there is no possibility, it seems to me, of pulling back before some crash occurs. So in my darkest moments, I do believe that we're headed for a fall. And I hate to say it, but that's what I believe in my darkest moments. In moments of insanity, I have hope. When I think that perhaps, just perhaps, enough people, not maybe only 10% of the population, come to recognizing the state of our affairs and to realizing that the current track is not going to save us, then we can perhaps begin to bend the system in ways that help. But there's no question we are going to see a decline in the scale of the human enterprise, including human populations, in this century. And the choice is, will it come from us because it's imposed by a violent climate, by nature, or will it come because we have the intelligence and foresight to rise to our true human potential as planners, as people capable of changing our own future? If we do that, then, you know, we have a chance to evolve even further, to live up to our name as Homo sapiens. If we don't do that, we don't deserve to survive on this planet. We'll be wiped out like any other maladaptive parasite that destroys its own host.
Yeah, it's a depressing choice between two very serious extremes. But I kind of have the feeling that we're going to have some kind of cataclysm combined with this a more rigorous demographic transition than we already have, because it's the way the curve is currently going. It's going to take a long time to get to any kind of inflection on population. Anyway, we've had enough about discussing population in the Vatican lately. Here's another question here from Beatriz, who said something over from YouTube, Rosinaldo Lima, asking whether, aside from the politicians, how can we fight against the global financial system that seems to be present in everything that we consume? How does the financial sector deal with these questions? Do we feel that the financial sector is responding?
I really understand global finance well enough to answer that question intelligently. But it seems to me one of the problems that we're encountering now is that finance has become a bigger part of the economy than the real goods and services economy. So if you look at the GDP of large countries, well, even large countries like Switzerland or many European countries, the finance sector, which produces nothing if utility, is now a bigger part of GDP than almost any other sector of the economy. Again, this is a social construct. It's a kind of perversion of reality because there's nothing there. The only reason Bitcoin is worth anything is because people think it's worth something. If the confidence in the value of Bitcoin disappeared, then the Bitcoin wouldn't be worth the computer time it's taking up. So there's no question that the finance sector has become a heavyweight in global economics. And we've been deluded into thinking that it is something of importance. And it is in one way in that it's influencing so much, but it's not so important in any material sense, right? It just doesn't exist. Interest is growing now faster than, say, the real world. We have a world that absolutely and utterly we depend upon, which is shrinking at 2 or 3% per year, and yet we're all striving to increase our wealth by 2 or 3% per year through the sleight of hand of the finance sector, which is completely detached from the biophysical reality that supposedly supports that finance sector. And once people, again, this is a huge problem, once people begin to realize the disconnect between global finance systems and the real world of material goods and services and food production and all of that, then the finance system collapses. Unfortunately, it takes down so much of the rest because most people now depend in pensions and so on the power of the financial system. That's probably a very weak response. It's just my perception of what's going on as a non-financial economist. Peter might have a great deal more to say about that than I do.
I don't know if I could really come any more coherent than that. I do feel that there has been some sensitivity exhibited particularly by the insurance industry to the calamities that is having to cough up lots of its assets for, so that there may be enough of a concern about securing and maintaining assets in the long term for some of the financial industry to respond more favorably and to start investing in things like restoration.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think it's true that the reinsurance business, that the insurers that insure the insurance companies were among the very first to raise the warning about even climate change, because they were suffering huge losses at an increasing rate every year, and not just because the human system was getting bigger, and the losses were getting bigger. Annual wave height in the oceans is getting bigger, so it causes more damage on shore, for example. So yeah, some portions of the finance community may be waking up to the realities confronting us.
Of course, they always figure out some way to hedge that. And figure out some kind of way to make a profit off of the loss. That's
well, look, if you go on, there are dozens of websites telling us why climate change is the biggest economic opportunity ever to confront humanity, because of the billions of dollars of investment in high tech that is going to be needed to change it. So yes, it sees every opportunity to self-aggrandize, really at the expense of everything else.
All of the economies in the Northern Hemisphere, the closest to the pole, are running like crazy to try and open up the northern corridors between the European and Russian economy and Canada and Alaska, I guess, because of the opportunities that have been opened up for seaway channels. Absolutely. So that's a win-win for the oil industry in Russia and Alaska. Anyway, I think we've come to the end of our time. And I don't know if there's any more questions from the audience in either side, either the YouTube or the Zoom component, but I haven't seen anything else. So I think that we're going to call it quits for tonight. But obviously, all of these issues that Bill has brought up are things that we are all facing in our ecological economics community here in Brazil, and that we need to face during the next 3 days of meetings. So thank you so much for coming down here from Vancouver virtually. It's a real pleasure to have you with us, and I hope you come back down in person next time and press the flesh.
I'd love to do that. And I do wish you all the best for this meeting. I look forward to seeing the proceedings, and I hope you answered almost all the questions that I've managed to pose this evening for you. So best wishes. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Bill. Bye, everybody.
Muito obrigado, Peter, pela mediação. Obrigado ao professor Bill Rees pela palestra. Eu imagino que todos os nossos estudantes que estão assistindo agora estão muito felizes porque o professor Bill Rees, ele trouxe uma perspectiva puro sangue, digamos assim, da economia ecológica. Então, o que ele mostrou é o que, de fato, a gente ensina aqui no Brasil. Então, esses problemas que também a gente coloca para os nossos estudantes. Eu gostaria de convidar agora o professor Leonardo, porque nós teremos, em seguida, uma uma atividade cultural. E, Léo, por favor, você explique tanto para as pessoas que estão nos acompanhando aqui no Zoom, como no YouTube, como será essa dinâmica.
Pessoal, boa noite mais uma vez. Então, aqui na UFSB nós temos o Centro de Formação em Artes e, com muito carinho, nós aprontamos algumas intervenções culturais, né, com essa sensibilidade dos nossos colegas das artes, para refletir um pouco sobre essa temática do evento. Seria muito importante, numa sessão de abertura, a gente certamente teria uma intervenção cultural com mais demonstração, né, das raízes da Bahia, mas nós seguiremos com esse método virtual, inspirados, né, parece até que fez uma conexão, vendo a palestra do professor. Uma das coisas que nos chama sempre a atenção é a necessidade de olhar para a ancestralidade, né, os nossos povos originários, os povos de origem de matriz africana, os nossos povos originários aqui da América do Sul, tem muito a nos ensinar, né? Uma vez, inclusive, a liderança Pataxó, aqui numa dessas palestras, estava falando para a gente de que sustentabilidade é um desses termos que a comunidade branca achou para colocar a sua cabeça tranquila no travesseiro, porque sustentabilidade é algo que eles vivem no dia a dia, né? Então, esse é o espírito, é mostrar um pouco da cultura da Bahia, mostrar um pouco essa ligação com esses povos, né, que formou esse povo baiano e o próprio povo brasileiro. E a professora Pamela vai ter um videozinho da professora Pamela, nossa colega aqui da UFSB, que compôs a intervenção. Eu peço que é um vídeo muito curto, né? Então eu peço que vocês permaneçam aqui conosco para apreciar essa parte. Daniel, contigo.
Acho que já pode reproduzir o vídeo, né?
Sim.
Olá, bom dia. Eu sou a Pamela Peregrino. Venho saudar todos os participantes do Encontro Nacional de Economia Ecológica. Muito feliz que vocês possam ver nossos filmes, que foram produzidos junto com a Baçada Deusa Oxum de Dejemim, um terreiro de candomblé lá do sertão da Bahia, em Paulo Afonso. Desde já deixo meu agradecimento à mãe Edneuza, a Iaquequerê Alzenir, que estiveram com a gente, apoiando e contribuindo na realização desse filme. Todos os filmes que vocês que estão disponíveis para o encontro, né? O Opará de Oxum, Quando Tudo Nasce, Oriqui, Iweuê de Ossanha, O Segredo das Folhas, são produzidos dentro da perspectiva de vida dos povos tradicionais de terreiro, que relacionam o culto, a vida, os saberes à própria natureza. Então não há como cultuar orixá sem o encantamento das folhas, das águas, dos mares. E a gente pode ver essa perspectiva de cuidado com a natureza, como cuidado de si, como cuidado do orixá. Espero que vocês gostem e aproveito e saúdo todos os povos tradicionais de terreiro, indígenas, que cuidam dessa nossa terra, das águas, dos ares, das pedreiras e das matas. Grande abraço a todos, espero que gostem.
A febre está à espreita. Icua morte. Transita em todos os continentes. Ceifa brancos, orientais, negros, pobres e ricos.
Ceifam sonhos e amanhãs. O homem de fé e o ateu.
O que tem o ori próspero, o que tem o ori burucu.
A febre está à espreita e mostra o caminho a Icu.
O Mulu já foi chamado. Não quer nenhum banquete. Dispensa o Olubagé.
O Molu conhece a peste e a solidão.
O Molu se entranha na floresta. Nela, encontra a água das corredeiras. E Oxum. Nela encontra Ossanha.
Ossanha abre os olhos de enxergar no escuro. Vê que Iku se disfarça de febre. Examina as folhas de peregum. Examina as flores que brotam no sol quente. Manipula as ervas que nascem na beira do rio.
Yansan quer guerrear com Iku. Grita a tempo, que ele pare, num instante apenas.
Tempo para cabisbaixo.
Yansan faz os bambuzais cantarem. Todos os orixás ouvem e cedem suas próprias folhas, favas e sementes ao sangue.
Tempo está parado para que haja tempo. Ossanha se recolhe entre cabaças e folhas. O Molu e Yansan dançam para entreter Iku. O Xumaré serpenteia no céu, tornando-se ponte entre a floresta e todas as nações do norte e do oriente.
Ossanha trabalha.
Ossanha vencerá Iku.
O Molu quer exterminar a febre.
O Molu vencerá Iku.
Yansan desperta o Batalá. O Batalá apazigua as almas. A água esfriará a febre.
Yansan vencerá Iku. O Batalá vencerá Iku.
O Molu ajoelha, bate 7 vezes com seu cajado na terra, levanta e cobre a humanidade com seu azer.
O Molu vencerá Iku.
Ossanha chega com seu preparo de ervas, favas e flores e sementes. Ossanha descobriu o remédio. Ossanha já escolheu as pessoas que receberão o segredo.
O Xumaré leva o segredo através do seu arco de cores até a humanidade. O Batalá apazigua Iku. Tempo recomeça a girar.
Haverá tempo.
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 Haverá tempo. Haverá tempo. Haverá tempo. Haverá tempo.
Haverá tempo de plantar, haverá tempo de colher, tempo de curar. Haverá tempo de viver, tempo de ser ou de não ser, tempo de apenas ceder, de batalha, de guerrear, tempo de esquecer de lembrar. E quanto tempo tem? Haverá tempo intemporal, tempo de Obaluaê, Oxumaré, cobra coral. Tempo do vento de Yansan, tempo de Ossanha pra curar. Folha do tempo já caiu, do Pachoro, de Obatalá, de Omolu, de Angorô, de Matamba e de Baba. Tempo do verde das mãos firmes de Catendê, Madacaiá. De todo tempo tem, mas há um tempo pra curar. De todo tempo tem, mas há um tempo tem para curar. O tempo, ororiqui tempo, ororiqui tempo. De todo tempo tem, mas há um tempo pra curar.
Muito obrigado, muito bonito o vídeo, gostei bastante, espero que vocês também tenham gostado. Nós estamos chegando ao final desta sessão de abertura e dessa palestra inaugural do 14º Encontro Nacional de Economia Ecológica. A partir de amanhã começam as apresentações de trabalho, né, Léo? E também as mesas redondas, as demais atividades. Eu gostaria de, após o encerramento, convidar as pessoas para que fiquem alguns minutos, né, para se quiserem interagir, conversar, né? Afinal de contas, hoje é a abertura do evento, então a gente está se reencontrando depois de 2 anos, o último evento foi em 2019. Léo, você gostaria de acrescentar algo?
Não, só manifestação de agradecimento mesmo e de um bom descanso a todos e todas, e a gente vai se encontrar aí até sexta-feira, com certeza, e quem sabe, quiçá, num evento presencial aqui na UFSB.
Obrigado, Léo, obrigado a todos que nos acompanharam. Pode encerrar a transmissão pelo YouTube, agora nós ficamos aqui nessa sala um pouco mais, para quem quiser conversar e se interagir, né? E pode chamar a vinheta, então, para a gente encerrar, por favor.